Indeed. Chris.
Thank you. Without further ado, Marcus introduced me at the beginning as covering both adaptation and forestry. Of course, today we're interested in adaptation, but it points up an important issue for DFID as an agency looking to spend effectively climate finance. Because we've found, I think...
Sorry, just move the
Oh,
mic.
yeah, sorry. Apologies.
Waving from the online people who weren't here otherwise. Thank you.
We've found that some of the distinctions that we take for granted at headquarters level, for example, don't play out in quite the same way in the country offices that we interact with, which is to say, how do you draw a hard distinction between adaptation and forestry and low carbon development and adaptation. So there are issues wrapped up together in there that we need to continually come back to and to work out what the appropriate response is. As you know from following what it is that we've been doing with the Fast Start finance, the commitment has been to devote 50% of the UK's Fast Start finance to adaptation. And I don't see that changing. An acronym that you'll hear in some of the comments that I make and others may ask questions about is the International Climate Fund, the ICF, which has been set up in the spending review last October and which is now a tri-departmental mechanism for spending the UK's climate finance. I think the expectation is, although it's not for me today to confirm it, that 50% focus on adaptation will continue as the working assumption, and I think that's important. But it does mean that we have to wrestle with some of these kind of artificial distinctions and boundaries in a way that isn't always productive. The only other thing I'd say in opening and with reference to the forestry, everything that Tom and Tim have said by way of making their presentations has been incredibly helpful, and it's very reassuring to sit alongside colleagues to know that we're thinking in roughly the same lines. We have different aspects of the agenda to work on, but there's nothing, I think, in what's being discussed which would come as a surprise to us in DFID, which is reassuring. Contrast that perhaps with forestry, where the long engagement that DFID has had with forest governance has allowed us to do some of that work with communities that Tim was describing in relation to adaptation, really to work with the beneficiaries and the local communities to make sure that those forest governance initiatives are targeted in the right way, that the way in which the VPAs under the EU regimes on forestry are put together is taking account of all stakeholder interests. So there is some experience there. But the RED agenda is very different in many ways. And some of you will be familiar with that interplay as well. By contrast, on adaptation, we're not seeing something which is different in that way. And again, I think in some ways that's reassuring, but it also means that we need to be constantly creative, looking for different ways of approaching issues which we perhaps assume are familiar. I think all I go on to say, and I'm aware, Marcus, of time constraints, is just to focus a little on, what you might call the where, the what, the how, and as Tim started describing it, the so what. In other words, what impact, what's the result coming out at the end of it. DFID within the ICF is at the moment working out how we can most effectively programme finance for adaptation. I've seen some colleagues, friends in the audience who have been to BOM meetings with the NGO community that DFID hosts, and we're looking forward to that continuing. The initial approach, of course, is to focus on the vulnerable areas in the way that Tim and Tom have identified them. Again, no surprise perhaps to hear me say that we don't expect to be moving in terms of bilateral programming beyond the countries where we currently have a presence. The bilateral aid review, the multilateral aid review processes have reported, again, I'm sure some of you will have seen those. So I think what we're expecting is that we will continue to work in those vulnerable areas where we have a presence. In terms of the what, I think again I need to refer to some of what's already been said in terms of the need to focus at the same time on what you might think of as building blocks, the capacity building elements, as well as the delivery of finance. In other words, a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is a critical need to work with partner governments to build their capacity. The NAPA processes represent one aspect of that, but again there are government-to-government links that can be built through the relationships that we already have. One thing that we are thinking about very hard is how best to programme in areas and sectors. So another part of the what, in addition to the type of intervention, whether it's capacity building or finance, is the range of interventions. And for an agency that has tended to develop a reputation, and that's continued since May last year, for health, education, basic services, that's a little bit of a challenge, because the analysis, of course, is telling us that agriculture, food security, water resource management, disaster risk reduction are the sorts of areas where DFID needs to be prioritising. And we have to ask ourselves searching questions, as all agencies will. Do we have the right skills? Do we have the capacity ourselves to be able to work on those areas? So that's another set of issues that we're wrestling with at the moment. The how, again, multilateral, bilateral, easy distinctions to make. Ultimately, it comes down to the way in which individual aid agency staff members interact with local communities. We, I think, in DFID and other agencies would be the same, tend to assume that you can achieve leverage working through multilaterals, and we will continue to explore opportunities through the Adaptation Fund. We'll continue to think about what we can best do with the World Bank and the CIF mechanisms, mindful again of that dichotomy between loans and grants. And we will take that thinking into the early phases of the Green Fund design, and that does represent a real opportunity. So I think you'll see a commitment, continuing commitment, because of course we're already represented on the board of the Adaptation Fund, to working with the Adaptation Fund. On the so what, this is where it gets really tricky, and why Tom is absolutely right to have identified the effectiveness of adaptation finance as the appropriate topic for a forum of this sort. We are wrestling with the VFM angles as well, of course, but simply setting indicators based on best practice is never an easy process. We are, of course, working with colleagues in country offices who have those relationships with the local communities that Tim's mentioned, who can bring the experience to bear on the sorts of things that we might want to fund. So I think one part of how to ensure effectiveness is making sure that we're thinking about the right local level indicators. There is a curious aspect, I suppose, in relation to the capacity of others. Value for money is, I mean, there are many different aspects to it, but ensuring that you have capacity amongst counterparts is something that we're thinking quite carefully about at the moment. It would be difficult for us, I think, to justify to all of our constituencies that in some of the most difficult areas for development programming, it would be appropriate to scale up rapidly for adaptation programming. But again, we know, and Tom's chart identified the need to work in those conflict-affected and fragile areas with the local communities. So there's a real set of issues there for us to focus on. And the final thing I think I'd say is that we're wrestling with how best to work with the private sector, which again is a kind of easy shorthand for a big box of different concepts. Tom's identified it in his final question in terms of leveraging private investment. It will be different for us in adaptation from colleagues who are working with low carbon development. I think our assumption is that there is perhaps less immediately available interest from private sector actors to work on adaptation. We may be proved wrong on that, and again that's something we need to explore. But it's something that we're bearing very much in mind, because we need to take full advantage of whatever opportunities are out there. Marcus, I'll leave it there if I may, mindful of the fact that there may be issues, questions, comments that people have.
Chris, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for all of you keeping to 10 minutes to allow us to keep questions at the end.